Good morning. My name is Adam Zurn, and I am the founder of Uncharted Lancaster. I'd like to thank you for tuning in this morning, and a special thanks to Willow Valley for inviting me back here today. Now, the eagle eye observers out there may have noticed that I am not broadcasting to you live from the Cultural Center due to some schedule maintenance. Instead, I am coming to you from Uncharted Lancaster World Headquarters, which may or may not be an unfinished corner of my basement. So, for those who aren't familiar, what is Uncharted Lancaster? And Uncharted Lancaster is a website that I run. You can find me online at www.unchartedlancaster.com, as well as Facebook and Instagram. Just search Uncharted Lancaster. But there I do two things. One, I like to highlight fascinating pieces of local history. So we're going to be talking a lot about Lancaster today, and here's an example. So Lancaster City is either the oldest or one of the oldest inland cities in the United States. It was founded in 1730, and when James Hamilton did that, it had a population of 15, which is a big difference today, which is just below 60,000. Another fun fact about Lancaster and just Pennsylvania in general, the Revolutionary War's biggest loser. You might think it was the King of England, but he still had lots of territory. In fact, the biggest loser of the Revolution would be William Penn. So with the Declaration of Independence, basically we voided William Penn's, or at this point his sons, the family charter for all of Penn's woods, and so they kind of walked away from that big land deal they had, empty-handed at the end of it. Now, opposite the history is the adventure side of Uncharted Lancaster. And there, as an incentive to go and visit some of the places that I've talked about, I've created a series of adventures and side quests that people can go and visit some of these places. And if you can, you'll solve the clues and decipher the riddles, I've got some, treasure out there. Nothing too glamorous, typically 3D printed tokens and plastic gems and buttons and pins and things like that. I also do, as I mentioned, some side quests, and I have a little self-minting coin set where I can make my own coins, and I like to stick those out at various places, and I'll just talk briefly about it, and the first person to get out there and find it gets to walk away with one of my adventure tokens. Has got a little extra life printed on it, which is a lot of fun. Always good to have an extra life in your inventory. Now, this past spring, I actually did run a real life treasure hunt, and I gave away $1,000. And so we set up a series of clues, and people had different places to go each week for 6 weeks, and there were clues and challenges to beat. And at the end was a 18-pound loot box full of $1,000 in $1 coins. The winners also got the painting. You can see it there. The winner's holding it by Lancaster artist Scott Cantrell, and there were some clues in pieces hidden there in the painting. So lots of fun, and hoping to do that again some point in the future here. So welcome, and today's presentation is entitled Lancaster's Sons of Liberty. And together we'll be exploring the epicenter for the spirit of independence and freedom right here in Lancaster County. Now, to find it, look no further than the crossroads at Penn Square, which at the time was known as Center Square. And so there we got a little aerial footage. Many of you have probably been down there, and I know the Willow Valley building is going to be very close to that exact location. But a lot of American history happened right here at this section, and in just a few blocks in every direction right here in Lancaster. So let's explore further. Just again, to give you an idea, Penn Square, just a very short distance from Willow Valley. You can just kind of jump on 222 and head north, and it's going to drop you off right there in Center Square. It's likely that James Hamilton, who originally laid out Lancaster, in an attempt to demonstrate his loyalty to the crown and perhaps even gain some royal favor, and again, you've got to remember, this is long before the Revolution, this is 1730, named his streets after the English monarchy. So, for example, the main east-west street was initially called High Street, but became King George Street. Then, the principal north-south street named after his bride, Queen Caroline. 1 block west of Queen was Prince of Wales Street. 1 block to the east of Queen was the Duke of York Street. Now, Lancaster stopped using the Old English names long before the American Revolution, and those streets simply became King, Queen, Duke, and Prince, as they're known today. Now, some people believe that Orange Street was named to recognize the royal house of King William III. However, there's little evidence to actually support this theory. Instead, the English had a tradition of naming streets after trees and nuts and berries and vines and fruits. And as such, Hamilton surrounded the royal avenues with chestnut, lime, lemon, vine, and orange streets. Orange is likely a reference to the fruit and not the royal house. Now, when Lancaster was founded, or was established, to rid Chester County of its thieves, vagabonds, and ill people on May 10th, 1729, the provincial government of Pennsylvania reminded the new commissioners that they had several essential tasks they had to be accomplished. The 3 biggest were selecting a county seat, erecting a courthouse, and building a jail. Now, recognizing the financial opportunities of having a county seat on or near your property, several men hatched plans to locate it near them. Columbia and Millersville both made strong bids. Innkeeper John Potwith exerted pressure on his guests and successfully actually had the first county court session held at his inn on August 5th, 1729. You can find his old tavern, which is now a private residence, at 1243 Long Lane outside of Millersville, next near Rock Hill. It's about an 11-minute drive from the cultural center here at Willow Valley. Now, a proper courthouse was finally built in 1738 at the center of Penn Square at the current site of the Soldiers and Sailors Monument. It was a 2-story brick English-style building with a bell and clock tower on the cupola, situated in the center of the town on a cobblestone square. There was a large meeting room on the first floor that had brick-paved flooring, and there were several rooms on the second floor. The coat of arms of the King of Great Britain was painted above the judge's chair until the American Revolution. The pillories, the stock, and the whipping post stood outside of the square, which was often a muddy duck pond in wet weather. In those days, no one ever accused these Lancaster constables of being soft on crime, as the pillory stocks and whipping post were in constant use. Justice was severe and swift in colonial America when judged by modern standards. A common tool of punishment was the pillory, where the unfortunate wrongdoer was fastened by the neck and wrists in the public square to be ridiculed and sometimes abused. Most colonial communities had a pillory. Lancaster was no different. And its pillory and whipping posts were located on the northwestern corner of Center Square near the courthouse. It was here that lawbreakers would be displayed in agonizing positions, often with bare backs streaked with dried blood and purple welts. In these early days, horse stealing was a frequent crime, but still a more serious offense was usually punished with a public whipping. On one occasion, a man accused of sedition against the king was sentenced to stand for an hour in the pillory and receive 15 lashes on his bare back. Women were not immune either to such punishment. In 1757, Ann Towes was convicted of adding a 0 to a 1-shilling note, raising it to 10. Her cleverness cost her ear and a public whipping of 21 lashes well laid across her back. In June 1744, hundreds of Native Americans gathered outside of Lancaster in a makeshift Indian village. Luckily for the residents, members of the Six Nation had assembled not to make war, but peace. The reason for the gathering was to negotiate what would be called the Great Indian Treaty of 1744. For 2 weeks, from June 22nd through July 4th, colonial leaders from Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia met with chieftains of the Six Nations. The important conference had two main purposes. One, secure Native American land for English settlement, and two, receive a guarantee that the Native Americans would not join the French in the border war. Men on both sides gave great speeches. The most famous was by the Native American chief Canassatego. He recommended that the colonies adapt a form of government similar to the Iroquois by forming a confederacy. He feared that the colonists lacked a strong, coordinated policy to address the military threat of New France. From his quiver, he pulled a single arrow, and with little effort, Canassatego broke it in two. Next, he pulled 6 arrows from his quiver, representing the 6 nations of the Iroquois. He tried to break the bundle of arrows, but was unsuccessful. Canassatego's words were soon published in Benjamin Franklin's newspaper and read by colonial leaders everywhere. His words, 40 years later, would influence the drafting of the United States Constitution. Even today, we're reminded of Canassatego's words when we look at the back of a dollar bill. There, you'll find the Great Seal of the United States. In the eagle's left talon is a bundle of 13 arrows representing the 13 original colonies and our strength when united together. Now, if you are looking for the epicenter for the spirit of independence in Lancaster County, look no further than a half block north of Penn Square to 30 North Queen Street. It was here that the Grape Hotel once stood. Established in 1742, the Grape was instantly recognizable with its large bunch of grapes as its tavern sign. Owned and operated by patriotic proprietor Adam Reinhardt, the tavern served as the general headquarters and meeting place for many of the Revolutionary patriots during the 1770s. A few days after the news of the Battle of Lexington reached Lancaster, a meeting of citizens was held there on April 27, 1775, to raise companies of 100 volunteers each and to make a survey of the available powder and lead in the community. The wooden cluster of grapes shown here on the right is on display at Lancaster History and is from the Grape Tavern. Numerous revolutionary groups and committees, such as the Committee of Observation and the Supreme Executive Committee, also met at the Grape. These committees were groups of local patriots who acted as a shadow government, usurping control of the 13 colonies from local officials during the American Revolution. Reinhardt officially joined the colonial militia, serving under his close friend and confidant, General Edward Hand. Reinhardt also supplied large quantities of agricultural products to the army through the several farms he owned. However, he was never compensated for most of the supplies and suffered substantial financial losses as a result. At least 2 presidents have enjoyed dining here. The Grape was one of George Washington's favorite colonial inns, and later, before becoming 15th president, James Buchanan was said to frequent the Grape Hotel as well. Because it was a market town, manufacturing center, commerce hubs, and located a convenient but safe distance from the fighting, large quantities of supplies for the Patriot Army were shipped from Lancaster, including cannons, ammunitions, rifles, camp kettles, grains, shoes, and uniforms. Lancaster even had military barracks, stables, warehouses, and a powder house to support the need of the troops. Hessian prisoners were often guarded these supply facilities. Just a half-mile away from Penn Square at 305 North Duke Street were the military stables for equestrian use of Washington's army during the Revolution. On the opposite side of the street stood the barracks where British and Hessians were imprisoned during this period. Let's turn our focus now to the Bausman House. Built in 1762 at 121 East King Street, just a block and a half east of Penn Square, German immigrant William Bausman built this cut sandstone 5-bay facade with Georgian features. It's a rare sight in an area where brick buildings were dominant. The cornerstone, located on the second story in the center of the house, has an alternate spelling of Bausman and includes his wife's name, which was unusual at the time. Bausman joined the Patriot cause very early in the struggle against Great Britain. He was a member of Lancaster's Committee of Correspondence and later served on the Committee of Observation and Inspection. Before the actual fighting started, he was a particularly aggressive in pursuing violators of the Patriot boycotts. Bausman was Lancaster's chief burgess, similar to the position of mayor, during the critical period between 1774 and 1777, when the city was inundated with exiles, refugees, prisoners, and militia. In 1777, he served as a special state commissioner responsible for the disposition of the estates of those defined as traitors by the State Council of Safety. As a merchant and innkeeper, Bausman kept the sign of the County House Inn. He was in a unique position to help the Continental Army. He held contracts with state and continental officers throughout the war to provide badly needed supplies, such as beef and lamb. For a brief period, Bausman was barracks master of the borough's prisoners of war facility, and he worked closely with other patriots in maintaining order in the borough. Here's a fun fact about the Bausman House. It has the eavesdropper. The carved eavesdropper under the west corner of the Bausman House is the only one of its kind in Lancaster. It reminds passerbys not to gossip, since someone is always listening. The concept of the eavesdropper dates back to the court of King Henry VIII. He had these carved and painted figures added to the eaves of the palace, Great Hall, in 1529, as a stern reminder to both staff and guests that he heard everything. Perhaps the most important maker of rifles and muskets in early Lancaster was William Henry. Henry resided in a brick home located on the northern portion of the current Central Market property from 1760 until he died in 1786. He was the gunsmith in charge of the purchase and repair of all arms for the Continental Army and was a delegate to the Continental Congress. At the southeastern corner of Central Market is a plaque commemorating his life. Now, just a half block south of Penn Square is the Georgian building dating from 1765. It was built by John Miller, who was a blacksmith, hardware merchant, land speculator, and founder of the town of Millersville. Miller entertained both George Washington and Benjamin Franklin in this building. From 1775 to 1817, the house was occupied by attorney and judge Jasper Yeates. When Yeates opened his law practice in Lancaster after being admitted to the Pennsylvania bar in 1765, he soon became the most prominent lawyer in the county. Yeates served as a chairman for Lancaster's Committee of Correspondence in 1775, the communication link for the city with the Second Continental Congress, just before the Revolution. He was also a captain in the Lancaster militia under Colonel Mathis Slowe. More about him later. Yeates also played a vital role in the organizing and equipping of the military. In 1776, the Continental Congress appointed Yeates to the Commission on Indian Affairs to negotiate a treaty with the Delaware Indians at Fort Pitt. The agreement gave American soldiers the right to travel through Delaware territory. Yeates was appointed as a justice of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, where he served with a distinction for the rest of his life. On August 8, 1794, George Washington appointed Yeates to negotiate with the participants of the Whiskey Rebellion in western Pennsylvania. The treaty successfully ended the uprising and guaranteed pardons for the rebels. Several thousands of British prisoners of war during the Revolution were sent to Lancaster, where they were put in huge stockades. Officers were paroled to live in rented quarters among the townspeople. Hessian prisoners were sent to Lancaster because the number of German-speaking residents. Some prisoners were kept in taverns and private homes. At least 315 skilled Hessian craftsmen worked for Lancaster employers. Many were given work to support the war effort, such as guarding supplies and making cannons, rifle barrels, and shoes for Washington's troops. After the war, many Hessian prisoners elected to stay here, get jobs, and marry. The most famous British prisoner was Major Andre. After Andre was taken prisoner when General Richard Montgomery captured Fort St. Jean in Quebec, he was sent to Lancaster as a POW. As an officer, he was allowed to find his own lodgings. Caleb opened his 25 North Lime Street to Andre, who reciprocated by giving art lessons to Cope's son. Like many prisoners, he gave his word of honor not to go near any seaport, town, or further than 6 miles from Lancaster. As a result, Andre soon had the freedom to go wherever he wanted as Lancaster and to live in the town without restrictions. After 4 months, he was paroled and returned to the British Army, where he rose in rank to adjunct general before being executed in 1780 for being a spy due to his involvement with Benedict Arnold. Today, the building where he lived is the site of the Temple Bethel. It was in the original courthouse in Penn Square that the Continental Congress, fleeing westward from Philadelphia to escape Lord Howe and the Redcoats, held a one-day session on September 27, 1777, giving Lancaster the claim to being the nation's capital for one day. After the legislative equivalent of a cup of coffee, the Continental Congress adjourned and continued their move west, settling in York, where they stayed for the next 9 months. In 1784, the courthouse was destroyed by fire on June 9th. John Hubley, in a letter to the Pennsylvania governor, John Dickinson, on June 11, 1784, detailed the destruction of the courthouse. Hubley speculated that the fire was caused by slacked lime for plaster repair or careless clock repairmen. Regardless, the destruction of the courthouse was complete. The court met at the home of Frederick Hubley until a new courthouse was erected on the same site. It was completed in 1787. It is here in this new courthouse at Penn Square that lawyers such as Thaddeus Stevens, James Buchanan, and Jasper Yeates first made history. It was also the scene for the inauguration of Franklin College, later to become Franklin Marshall College. Hosted visits of George Washington, more on that later, and many receptions to other notables, such as an early nomination of James Buchanan for vice president under Franklin Pierce in 1852. Interestingly, Buchanan declined the vice president nomination, and the convention instead selected Buchanan's close friend, William King. Pierce went on to win the 1852 election. So one of those missed moments for Buchanan there, could have definitely been vice president and then perhaps later president. As one of Lancaster's most famous native sons, Devil Dave Miller was an eccentric and amiable character. He served as the Lancaster County Sheriff in the 1830s. Miller had been elected to his post running on the anti-Mason platform. He was a humanitarian and an avid horseman who suppressed race riots against blacks. Miller was also a military veteran, an early railroad entrepreneur, and owned a hotel. Part of Miller's notoriety came in 1834 while serving as sheriff. On one occasion, he returned a bench warrant by riding his horse up the courthouse steps and then down the courtroom's main aisle, where he dismounted in front of the bench and presented the documents to Judge Lewis in person. The following year, in 1835, Miller aided 3 prisoners in their escape from the county jail while serving as sheriff. What would motivate the chief law enforcement officer for the entire county to do such a thing? As it turned out, bounty hunters had abducted two formerly enslaved women and one of their sons as runaways who had been living in rural Lancaster County. They were held in the jail while waiting for transport to the Carolinas. However, before this could happen, Miller opened their cell one night and let the trio walk out. The women told sympathizers that they had escaped by themselves, apparently to cover for Miller. It wasn't until years later that Miller admitted his part in the escape, and as it turned out, Miller was also a big supporter of the Underground Railroad. Here in this photo, you can see an old foundation of the jail behind the Fulton Theater, and that's the jail that would have housed those black slaves that Miller helped escape. By the mid-19th century, it was clear that the old Penn Square courthouse could no longer accommodate the expanding population and court demands. After much deliberation, a new courthouse was constructed in 1852 at its current location at North Duke and East King Street. Here's a photo of the building in 1875 from the Atlas of Lancaster County. The home on the property had once belonged to George Ross. Ross was one of the signers of the Declaration of the Independence and uncle to Betsy Ross, who made the first American flag. A statue called Justice, carved by William P. Bolton for $200, was placed on the cupola of the courthouse in 1855. She holds a balanced scale in her left hand and, interestingly enough, wears no blindfold. Traditionally, Lady Justice is depicted as wearing one to indicate that justice is impartial and objective. However, for some, the blindfold is redundant and unnecessary, as was the case here of the artist who carved it. Believe it or not, there's actually a miniature replica of the 1787-1853 Penn Square Courthouse in Buchanan Park today. In 1918, students at Stevens High School, also known as the Girls High School, Stevens Elementary School, and now the residents at Stevens, built this replica. Known as the Liberty Bond House, it was placed in Penn Square in front of the Watson Shad building during World War I and World War II. Volunteers sold Liberty bonds from the building. Every time a bond was sold, they rang a bell, which happened to be the original bell from the second courthouse. Shortly after each war ended, the bond house was moved back to its current location in Buchanan Park, next to Franklin and Marshall College in the shadow of Gallows Hill. Now, before it was the Lancaster County Convention Center, the southeast corner of Penn Square was also home to the Watson Shad department store. Done in a beautiful style, the building had 4 stories of buff brick with elaborate terracotta and marble ornamentation. The oldest section of the building facing East King Street dates back to 1898 and was designed by famous Lancaster architect C. Elbum Urban. The department store operated from 1879 until 1992. However, the first business to operate in this location was the White Swan Hotel. Located a few feet from the old Lancaster Courthouse, the White Swan was a popular resting place for people visiting or passing through the town. It was the most well-known of the old Lancaster inns. It was first opened in 1754 and began a century-long history of accommodating both travelers and local patrons. The White Swan was operated by Matthias Slough, whose father built the hotel in 1754. Slough was prominent in both local and provincial affairs. In fact, he was the county coroner at the age of 21 and later became an assemblyman. Slough was also a member of the Committee of Observation for the Borough of Lancaster in 1774. Later, during the Revolution, he served as an officer, The location for the White Swan and the civic and political activities of Swan made the hotel a popular center for entertainment of distinguished visitors such as George Washington, John Marshall, Lafayette, and John Adams. Several members of the Continental Congress spent the night while Lancaster briefly served as the capital in 1777. Now, I've mentioned George Washington several times, and George Washington visited Lancaster 5 times. So the country's first president was no stranger to the city. According to L&P, George Washington visited on June 4th, 1773, July 4th, 1791, November 14th, 1793, October 26th, 1794, and September 20th, 1796. Now, here's a little fun fact about George Washington. Did you know that Washington had 2 birthdays? In 1752, Great Britain adapted the new and improved calendar instituted by Pope Gregory XIII, late in the 16th century. The newly imposed Georgian calendar, as it had become known, fixed the length of the solar year at 365 days, with an additional day being added every 4 years. Leap year. The switch to the Georgian calendar from the Julian calendar, named for Julius Caesar, was because the old calendar had become out of whack by a whole 10 days. In 1752, it was off by 11 full days, so those days were dropped that year. The day following February 1st, 1752, for instance, was not February 2nd, it was February 11th. So George Washington's old birthday of February 11th jumped all the way to February 22nd. However, the president wasn't opposed to celebrating on both dates, as he noted in his diary numerous times. Washington's first visit to Lancaster was on June 4th, 1773. In his diary, Washington wrote, "For breakfast at the Sign of the Bull, 13 miles from the ship. Dined at Lancaster, 19 miles further, and lodged at Wright's Ferry, 10 miles from Lancaster." Records indicate that Washington visited the Demuth tobacco shop and made a purchase while in town on June 4th, and likely met the proprietor, Johannes Demuth. Washington's second visit to Lancaster came on July of 1791. Now serving as president, Washington was touring southern and eastern states. He came to Lancaster via York on Sunday, July 3rd, to visit his old friend and military aide, General Edward Hand. Hand, with other Lancaster dignitaries, met Washington at Wright's Ferry, now Columbia, to escort the president to Lancaster. The president's coach arrived at the outskirts of Lancaster at around 6 p.m. on July 3rd. As was Washington's habit, he exited his coach and entered Lancaster on horseback. The president was greeted with ringing church bells, cheering crowds, waving flags, and firing cannons. Here's another fun fact, an interesting side note. I recently read Ron Chernow's biography of George Washington entitled Washington, A Life. Chernow made it very clear that Washington loathed these greetings. It made traveling anywhere a slow and tedious process, as he had to endure such events every time he entered and left town. Washington spent the night at the White Swan Hotel, located again on what is now Penn Square. The following morning, Washington had the opportunity to walk the streets. He spent the rest of the day at an elaborate lunch in the courthouse in the square, and 15 toasts were made. The final toast was to the illustrious President of the United States. After taking tea with General and Mrs. Hand that afternoon and spending a quiet evening with old friends, the president left Lancaster the next morning at 4 p.m. to go to Philadelphia. Washington's final visit to Lancaster occurred on September 20th, 1796, when he spent the night there on his way from Philadelphia to Mount Vernon. The Lancaster Journal on September 23rd, 1793, wrote the following concerning Washington's brief Lancaster visit. The President of the United States arrived here on Tuesday afternoon last, September 20th, and on Wednesday morning at 6 o'clock proceeded on his way to Mount Vernon. At the risk of getting too political, I'd like to share two additional fascinating stories from the Chernow biography on Washington that I was unaware of. The 8 years Washington spent as commander-in-chief of the Continental Army during the Revolution left him near financial ruin. Washington was so poor at the start of his presidency that he had to borrow £100 to afford the trip to New York City for his own inauguration. Can you imagine having to borrow £100 just to be able to attend your own swearing-in ceremony? How things have changed. Another interesting fact was that Washington was childless. He and Martha never had any of their own children. Martha had 2 from a previous marriage that Washington raised as his own. However, his stepson died during the Revolutionary War, and he raised his stepson's 2 youngest children as his own. But the fact that Washington was childless allowed him to be the father of the nation. The country had just unshackled itself from a monarchy, and so when the idea of a president was brought forth, there were immediate concerns that the states would potentially be getting a new one. The fact that Washington did not have a son put most of those concerns aside. There'd be no, George Jr. to take over. Furthermore, the book said that the lack of a daughter prevented potential marriage offers from France, England, and Spain. So, those just wouldn't happen because he didn't have a daughter. If he had, there would have likely been some, marriage proposals from royalty, and that would have tied the fledgling nation to a European monarchy, creating a possible ruling class. So, just wonderful luck that Washington did not have his own children. So let's shift our focus a little bit north of Penn Square, and we're going to be looking at the Ellicott House. So this Georgian house at 123 North Prince Street was built around 1787. However, the building's most famous resident was Major Andrew Ellicott. He rented the property from 1801 to 1813, after he was appointed Secretary of the State Land Office by Pennsylvania's first governor, Thomas Mifflin. At this time, Lancaster was the state capital. Now, Ellicott was a busy man. He completed the plans for the Capitol at Washington, D.C. Ellicott spent 4 years surveying Florida for the United States government. For Pennsylvania, he served the Commonwealth's northern border with New York State, a difficult task through rugged country. And he was a member of the commission which completed the work of drawings on the Mason-Dixon line. Now, on July 4th, 1803, President Thomas Jefferson completed the Louisiana Purchase. This $15 million land deal added an additional 828,000 square miles to the United States. The next step was to survey this mainly unknown territory. Ellicott, then too old to undertake the proposed wilderness expedition, agreed to instruct a young Army captain by the name of Meriwether Lewis with the necessary skills that Ellicott had devised or adapted from conventional equipment, specialized survey instruments from over his lifetime. Lewis spent several weeks here in Lancaster at 123 North Prince Street as a guest of Ellicott to complete his training. Sounds a bit like Luke visiting Yoda on Dagobah. Today, the building serves as office space for the Historic Preservation Trust of Lancaster County. The trust uses a variety of methods to encourage and facilitate preservation throughout Lancaster County. On July 4th, 1874, Lancaster dedicated the Soldier and Sailors Monument that stands at the heart of Penn Square. The 43-foot-tall Gothic Revival Memorial was initially designed to pay tribute to Lancaster Union soldiers killed during the Civil War. However, Today, it represents all of those who served in all American military conflicts. The monument stands where the courthouse once did. 5 hand-carved stone figures define the monument. 4 men representing the infantry, navy, artillery, and cavalry surround the base. The larger-than-life robed genius of liberty with body armor, drawn sword, and shield stands atop the pillar facing north. According to legend, this is a deliberate depiction of turning her back on the southern states. Thaddeus Stevens was the most influential leader of the Republican Party during the Civil War. When Stevens moved to Lancaster in 1843, he practiced law at his home office here on Queen Street, just below Penn Square. Stevens was a champion for a free public school system in Pennsylvania and an abolitionist. In fact, his home was a stop on the Underground Railroad. Archaeologists digging at his home in 2003 discovered a cistern with a patched hole in the wall. It connected to a tunnel and a patched doorway into the adjacent building. It is believed that the cistern was used as an emergency hiding place for fugitives. If you walk around the building, around the corner of the convention center on Vine Street, you can see the cistern in Stevens' basement through the window. If the convention center is open, you can go inside and look. Stevens was largely responsible for the pressure on Lincoln to make the emancipation of slavery a primary objective of the Civil War. He insisted on a post-war Reconstruction policy that would prevent the South from regaining its former power in Congress. Stevens was buried per his instructions in Lancaster's Shriner Cemetery, just a short distance from the Ellicott house at 123 North Prince Street. At the time, it was the only cemetery in the city with no restrictions for interment based on color or race. Stevens wrote the inscription for his own headstone. It reads, "I repose in this quiet and secluded spot, not from any natural preference for solitude, but finding other cemeteries limited as to race by charter rules. I have chosen this that I might illustrate in my death the principles which I advocated through a long life, equality of man before his Creator." At 42 West King Street, 1 block west of Penn Square, is the birthplace and residence of Major General John F. Reynolds. As a brilliant military strategist, he was considered by both the Union and Confederate armies to be the best general in the North. Born on September 20th, 1820, he was one of 13 children, many of whom died before reaching adulthood in this very building. In 1837, he was nominated by the United States Military Academy at West Point by, wait for it, future President James Buchanan, a friend of Reynolds' father. General Reynolds was eventually offered command of the Army of the Potomac, but he refused, stating that he did not want to take orders from Washington politicians. His distinguished military career included the Battle of Chancellorsville, the Second Battle of Bull's Run, and making the critical tactical decision to start the Battle of Gettysburg. Many historians consider the 3-day battle to be the turning point of the Civil War. Shortly before the battle, Reynolds engaged his lifetime Catholic sweetheart, Catherine Mary Hewitt. The engagement was complicated by the fact that Reynolds was a Protestant, so the relationship was kept a secret. The two had planned to marry upon his return from Gettysburg. As a symbol of their engagement, John gave Kate his class ring from West Point, while Kate gave John a gold ring with the inscription, "Dear Kate." She also gave him a medallion to wear around his neck to keep him safe. Kate even pledged to enter religious life if John died in combat. Tragically, Reynolds did not survive the war. He became one of Gettysburg's first fatalities, dying instantly when he was shot through the neck by a Confederate sharpshooter while leading his men into battle. He was the highest-ranking soldier on either side killed in the three-day conflict. However, Reynolds' story doesn't end with his July 1st death. 2 days later, a reluctant but grief-stricken Kate called on Reynolds' sisters before the funeral. She was so distraught that she sat with the general's body throughout the night. His funeral took place the following day on July 4th at Fulton Hall, now Fulton Theater, and was buried in Lancaster Cemetery. Some people believe that Kate's grief was so deep that Reynolds' spirit never found peace. As such, his ghost wanders the streets between Fulton and his family home, looking to meet his fiancée, just as he has promised he would more than 150 years ago. So, if you feel a chill while walking near 42 West King Street and notice a tall, handsome, oddly dressed man, there's a good chance that you just saw the ghost of John Reynolds. Hey, I would like to thank you for spending some time with me this morning as we talked about Lancaster's Sons of Liberty. I'd like to kind of leave you with this, parting words of advice and to get out and explore your own backyard. We have so much rich and amazing history right here, not only in Lancaster County, but even just in Lancaster. Get out, do some walking tours, visit these historic and iconic places and the people that live there. Just so much wonderful history to see and experience right here in our own backyard that often goes unnoticed. I'd like to encourage you to come back. I will be here one last time for the summer on August 9th, and I will be talking about the Pequea that almost was. Specifically talking about the Pequea Inn, which was Lancaster's answer to Lake Placid. And this was a super mega hotel that was actually started but not completed. So we're going to learn about this hotel and what happened in Pequea. As you can see, it's a short distance from Willow Valley, just a 20-minute drive. And believe it or not, before the Great Depression, Pequea was a premier tourist destination. In fact, there was another big hotel down there called the Riverview Hotel, and Calvin Coolidge is said to have stayed there during his presidency. He signed the guest book, which is on display at the Conestoga Area Historical Society, and sports star Jack Dempsey also stayed there as well. So hope to see you back on July 9th. Again, I would like to thank you for listening and your attention today. I am Adam Zurn from Uncharted Lancaster. You can learn more local history and have an adventure by visiting my website, www.unchartedlancaster.com. Thank you and have a great morning.